to Phoenixville Public Library and our local author book talk tonight, and an author who has been with us before, and glad to have with her again to promote her brand new book about Phoenixville. Phoenixville becoming a cottage industry here in the fiction area. Thank you, June. June McInerney, and McInerney is an accomplished literary critic, freelance editor, and author. She has written several collections of short stories, 2 volumes of poetry, and books and lyrics for 3 musicals that have been produced over the years by various theaters across the country. Originally from New York, she holds degrees in mathematics, English literature, and theology. She currently lives here in Phoenixville, where as a member of the Historical Society of the Phoenixville area, she writes an occasional article or 2 for its newsletter. Her book, which is available for sale and autographing afterwards, Phoenix Hose, Hook, and Ladder, is the 4th in her Novels of Phoenixville historical series of fiction. Glad to have her back with us tonight, and we'll let her introduce her guest, June McInerney. Come on up.
Thank you, Mark.
Welcome.
Thank you, everybody. Okay, thank you for having myself and David here, and I'll get to David in just a little bit. It's February. I was here exactly 1 year ago last year, and so here I am again to share the story of my 4th, and I can't believe it's 4th, historical novel of Phoenixville. And this one is entitled Phoenix Hose, Hook, and Ladder. So I'm going to beg your indulgence. I've done a number of these presentations in the past year. I'm still a little nervous, so give me a little bit here. Okay, as Mark mentioned, I've lived in Phoenixville for over 40 years, longer than the small town in New York where I was born and raised. I came here in 1976 for the bicentennial. I saw the wagon train go through. Yeah, it was really neat. I fell in love with the area and stayed because it reminded me of the town I grew up in. And over the course of the years, as Phoenixville grew out of the ashes of the closing of the steel and bridge companies, I grew to truly love our historic Victorian town with its diverse history, culture, and of course, the residents. Because I love the history so much, I decided I needed to do something about that. And you see, this is what the result is. When I retired nearly 7 years ago, I've gotten to know quite a few of you. And though I spend most of my time as a hermit sequestered in front of my laptop writing historical novels, so I'm not out on the tennis courts with Gwen Hagee, and you're familiar with the first 3. The Prisoner's Portrait, followed by the Schuylkill Monster, and then Columbia Hotel. Well, let me tell you about the latest and how it came to be. Last October, actually it was October of 2016, I was looking for another novel to write. And I knew that we were coming up to the 100th anniversary of our participation in the Great War. So I kind of tootled into, on the first Wednesday, I tootled into the Historical Society. And there was an exhibit that was mounted that was the history of Phoenix Hose, Hook, and Ladder, the fire department. And I was instantly struck because I have to tell you, when I was growing up in Dobbs Ferry, New York, my Uncle Dougie, my father's oldest brother, was a fire chief there. And I remember him dearly riding the back. He used to steer the back of the hook and ladder. How he did that, I have no idea, but okay, some of you firemen here, fire people will know, firefighters will know this. And I was absolutely impressed. I was impressed with my Uncle Dougie anyway. But in the number of years that he was the firefighter before he lost his life in the call to duty, I had tours of the fire department. I was always fascinated with it. So I thought, well, okay, this is like really interesting. And the exhibit had so much. It had bells and whistles and all kinds of stuff. And I was like really impressed. But most importantly, the one person that was there was Dave Meadows, who then was the president of Phoenix Hose, Hook, and Ladder. And I was introduced to him, and we got to chatting, and I told him about Uncle Dougie, and I told him that I really wanted to write a novel about World War I to coincide with the exhibit coming up the next January, And Dave turned to me and he said, well, why not do it about, the fire department as well? And actually I said, I want to do it about the fire department, and he said, do it about World War I, and so I combined the both of them. So, I wondered, could I put the two together, and could I write about the devastation that was wreaked overseas, and how did that affect the local residents here in Phoenixville, and could I possibly pull a story from both of them? And so I had a character in mind, Stanley Martinez, who had just come of eligible age when the first Selective Service Act of 1917 was passed that April. Now, while a somewhat patriotic young American, he was not in favor of the war and would probably refuse to register for the draft. How would this choice affect his life? How would it affect his family and friends who lived in Phoenixville? Ruminating on this as I walked into the museum, I kind of got off track here. I chatted about that with Dave, and rather than spending my time rooting through the archives and microfiche papers of 1917 and 1918, I found myself immersed in the exhibit. An idea was forming in the back of my mind. Now, Dave was selling a book. He wrote this really wonderful book, which is the history of the fire department from its inception in 1874 to 1999. And of course, I bought a copy. And I brought it home, and I started pouring through it. As I jotted down some ideas from reading the history of the fire department, coupled with what I remember about Uncle Dougie, and putting together what I wanted, to write about Stanley, the novel started to take shape. It was, born, I guess, conceived. And then a few weeks later, Dave gave me a grand tour of the firehouse and reiterated a bit more of its history. Now, I learned a lot about the history of Phoenix #1 at Dave's side during the discovery of the archives. I learned a lot through his book, but there's a whole lot more. And so at this point, I would like to introduce you to what in the past year has been my cohort in crime and editor and mentor, Dave Meadows. Also,
thank you. Never been a big history fan back in grade school, elementary, or high school. As I got older, I became very immersed in Phoenixville's history and started buying postcards from the turn of the century. And then eventually, as I was a member of the fire company, there were more and more mementos were turning up over time. And we had some that our predecessors had held on to, and so I started organizing them. And then 1998 came, and we said, well, next year's our 125th anniversary, so good time to, maybe we should put a history book together, in a more thorough history book. So this is what June had mentioned. So we had about 1,100 copies of these printed out, and there's probably about 10 or 15 left at the Historical Society that are for sale for $10 a piece. But it goes to 1999. It's full of pictures. I undid some of the early histories that talked about an old hand pumper being our first piece. Well, I went back to Borough Council minutes from 1873 and found out what really happened, and it wasn't the hand pumper. In fact, the hand pumper didn't turn up in our annual report until we lost minutes between 1890 and 1899 due to a leak in the roof, it says. So all the ink ran. So, but I know in 1889 there was no hand pumper. In 1899 there was. So somewhere in that time frame, Phoenix Steel donated a hand pumper. So this is a postcard that shows our building along with the Church Street School. This is the 1900 building, probably in its finest day. That's a 1903 Holloway Chemical hose wagon and the horse team. So I know this probably is the way the station first appeared after it was built. Over time, things started disappearing off the structure over the next 30 or 40 years. Like the balcony went, the bell tower went, that little fence type thing went off, the front doors got changed, to the point where what you see on Church Street now is still this building. It just doesn't look like it anymore. So with out of
Is some
W
of the
Lux.
original frame left, or
Well,
just
the
the arrangement?
the second floor is gone. There's a brick arch system that the trucks park on. We've reinforced it twice structurally, but we're limited to what we can put in there. And if you really want a thrill, go down in the basement and roll the trucks in and out. Test your nerves. So let me see if I can get this presentation going.
Did the average age of your troops change for you? For example, like during World War I, the average age was 16.
Yeah.
Was it similar
no.
within the?
When I joined, it was 18 to join. We've started taking junior members in, and we had it as low as 14, and we decided that we were just babysitters, and their parents dumped them on us, and it was, so now it's up to 16, so, anyway.
Do you find many with a serious mind frame at that age?
Yeah, some of them
More
do.
exploratory?
It's more, you know, what's driving them to be there in the first place. But let me get on, so, again, this is since 1874. Other than a few churches, we're probably the oldest nonprofit in the borough. I mean, we're coming up on the 150th anniversary in another 6 years, so.
How do you sustain? Is there a foundation?
Well, a lot of ways over the years. Let me get into this. So we were first organized 1873 and 1874. Prior to 1874, there was no organized fire company. I mean, a lot of times it was the citizens of town. Just doesn't show up on there. So that's a leather fire bucket. And back in the day, every household had to have a leather fire bucket. And if the bell or whatever you used to alert the town that there was a fire, everyone was supposed to turn out with their fire bucket and fill them and then pass them down a line that they either threw on the fire or pump. But well, anyway, 1873, the borough put a water system in. And they put a pumping station along the river, a filter plant, put the reservoir up where it is right now over at Reservoir Park to take advantage of elevation, and then they had water mains coming down and hydrants in the core of Phoenixville. So, with that being said, having a pressurized water system with hydrants, even if you're getting 40 or 50 pounds, was a big advantage. So a gentleman named Charles Schaefer, who was a veteran fireman and lived in Norristown, approached the borough about organizing the fire company. That was in July of 1873, and by the following March of 1874, what's that, 8 months, 9 months? A lot happened. It would never happen today. So the borough went out and purchased two used fire trucks in 1075. At the time, anybody been to Root Down behind Molly McGuire's? It's the old Superior Bottling. Well, that building, if you took the brick front off, was the original Savoy Theater, which was created from the Market House, and then next to that was the firehouse was attached to it. So the Market House is where farmers took their goods, kind of like the market center on a Saturday, plus Borough Council met in there, but they added a small addition to the firehouse after they bought a lot next door, and it was an irregular shaped building, and that's where they housed the fire company. So March 3rd, 1874, and we still have the original minutes from that in our archives. 37 charter members, they were all volunteer, and of course one of the first orders of business was to go out and buy a bell and erect a bell tower for alerting the members when there was a fire, and the bell tower happened to be constructed by Phoenix Iron. So we were originally called Phoenix Hose Company. So our first firehouse was on North Main Street, where I just mentioned. Fire apparatus that they bought was a used hose carriage, which is depicted here, and a used ladder wagon. You had leather hose back then, and the borough's new water system basically gave what you needed. Now, so all you need to do is bring hose, hook it to a fire hydrant, and it was better than throwing buckets of water, which we did in the past. So later in 1875, we recharted ourselves as Phoenix Hose Hook and Ladder Company #1. This ribbon is the only one I've ever seen, and that hangs in Fireman's Hall in Philadelphia. It's the City of Philadelphia's Fire Museum. And it is clearly ours, and it depicts our first two pieces of apparatus. So, again, I'm going to break this down. This is a lot about the evolution of our fire apparatus. So from 1874 to 1903, this is basically what we had. I don't have any pictures. I have yet to find any, and I'm always looking if somebody would happen to come up with something. I'd like to borrow and scan it. But this, going back to what the ribbon look like. These are as close as we can come to what the hose reels look like in the ladder wagons, and of course they were all manually propelled. People
Looks like
pushed them.
work.
People pushed them. Now, and when you think about that, this thing carried about 600 feet of leather hose, and the hose, in order to keep it from breaking and cracking, had to be oiled with each foot oil. So at the time, the borough streets were dirt and cinders, so if you laid hose down the street, when you cleaned it up, you had to scrub it, let it dry, and then they had a pump to pump each foot oil through it. So eventually they realized that they needed a second hose wagon because the turnaround was too quick, or wasn't quick enough. So we wound up with these two pieces of apparatus, 35-foot of ladder on there, and then we wound up with two hose reels by the end of the first year. In 1881, the fire company purchased their own property on Church Street, which is currently where we are. It had a wood frame building, and the cost was $5,000. They had $50 in their treasury, and they used that as a down payment. Place. So, and after some renovations to the wood frame building to make it suitable for a firehouse, they moved into it in 1882, moved the bell tower up to Church Street. And the bell tower was used for a lot more than sounding of fire alarms. I mean, when I went through the minutes and some of the old newspaper articles, I mean, 4th of July, 1876, the 100th anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence, they say they rang that bell all night. And they'd often go to a parade, an away parade, and come back 10 or 11 o'clock at night, and I'm sure there was a little beer involved, and then they would decide that it was time to run around the streets ringing the bells and ringing the bell tower. So I think the citizenry probably tolerated it fairly well back then. Okay, and then moving on, we had two hose wagons at the same time, or hose reels. We actually had 4 of them from our records over time, because as they broke down, they would be replaced. So the information on those is a little sketchy. And then, of course, I mentioned that the hand pumper was donated by Phoenix Iron Company. Now, one thing, when you think about where our first one, now we're in our second firehouse at the second location. The first one was back at Root Down behind Molly McGuire's. And everything's pushed. So where do you put your firehouse? At the bottom of the hill? So this was a big advantage moving up to the top, and I'm sure this had something to do with why they selected up on Church Street, the high point. At least you had gravity going along.
Then you had to hold it back when you're going down.
Yeah. All right, now this is the earliest picture I can find. Now that's the Church Street School on the left, and it's around 1890, and if you look, this doesn't work on there. But that little building beyond the Church Street School was our original firehouse that we were in from 1882 till 1899. I tried to blow it up, and it doesn't really come out too well, but I've never seen anything more. And I can date this because I know if you look, there's 1, 2, 3, 4 windows across. Well, the newer firehouse that was built in 1900 has a different amount of windows here. So in 1870, that was purchased, that ladder wagon was purchased from the city of Reading and their Washington Fire Company, and that's in Reading. Chief Rare from the Reading Fire Department had supplied me that back when I wrote the book. So that went in service and replaced that hand-drawn one, but at the time, we didn't own any horses at the firehouse, so I assume they must have had an arrangement with somebody to borrow horses in time of need. And then if I look at this is the hand pumper that was donated by Phoenix Iron sometime in the 1890s. So, and if you look at this in detail, there's a trough right here. It just sticks out from the side of the wagon, and there's one on either side, and the idea was to throw buckets of water in there. This is a big tub with inlets, and these are big dry plungers up and down, which will run it up through a chamber and out a hose or nozzle at the top. Or you can hook it to I guess, a hose and a hydrant. Now, this thing here had been modified to work off a hydrant, so you could flood the water tub in the bottom just off hydrant pressure. So, of course, this is what we had. There's 2 little planks that flip out on either side here, so and you would have the 2 people up top and 4 on the side here. So 6 on each side pumping this thing up and down. So if I can get this to work.
What
this will
was the
work.
main cause of a lot of fires back in the day?
Hold on one second.
Oh, sorry.
Okay, well, you guys are short. Okay, you don't?
Now this is the company that has their own hand pumper
Push.
in operation, but this will give you an idea just what was involved in trying to get one of those things to work.
Whatever.
Yeah, you need they said you had about 4 or 5 minutes and you needed a crew to yeah. Weaverville, so they're using the name of their town, trying to get a patent. You got a pretty good stream of water coming in. Huh?
God, I hope they ate well.
Now here's where we get the technical difficulties. Trying to get this thing to come back in.
The slide mode.
Yes, the slide mode. All right.
There you go.
Yeah, that's the second version. I had 2 of them running because I couldn't figure out how to get out of that. So. All right, so where is that hand pumper today? Well, when I wrote the history book in 1999, I had no idea where it was. About 3 years ago, I found a picture on the internet for the Pennsylvania National Fire Museum, which is located and owned by the city of Harrisburg. So I had that picture that we had there, and we made a connection out there with the president of the museum, and we made a trip out there. 4 of us drove out and brought our black and white glossy built up, and we get down on the floor, and every nut, bolt, knot hole matches. So without a doubt, they had no idea where it had come from, and we have a newspaper article from 1936 that said we sold it to a national museum. Well, I checked with the Smithsonian, and nobody had it. The Smithsonian never had fire apparatus, they said. So anyway, this wound up in a private collection. It went to Dr. Halbert Fillinger, who's a forensic pathologist from Montgomery County. When he passed away, his son sold some of the stuff, and the city of Harrisburg gobbled this up. So they have it as a 1792 piece. They say it's one of the oldest remaining pieces in the United States for a sample. But here you can clearly see the trough where you dump buckets of water, and you can see where the plungers went up and down. And it's in pretty good shape. The bottom's all rotted out, but.
Do they now have it identified as coming from us?
That I don't know. I haven't been back. I'm going to push them on
Road
that.
trip.
So anyway, so we went out there. We had a great time with these guys out there. So. All right, now where's one of our hose reels? Now we believe the one in Fireman's Hall is ours. They did not have it identified for us, but in 1999 I got a letter from one of their curators down there, along with a picture of the maker's plate off in here, right there, which said, yeah, you know what, the name on that maker's plate of Wolf and Bay was the manufacturer or the maker. Quite possibly it is ours. And that, remember the blue ribbon I showed you at the beginning? Well, why else would that ribbon be down there? So, kind of where we are. So again, I've got that letter. I need to take the time to go back up and try and see if we can get a little credit. And the hand pump, Phoenix Iron Company purchased it at some time, whether they bought it new or bought it used, but they have only had that hand pump and 3 or 4 hose reels in use that they would assist the fire companies in time of need or lend equipment out. So. All right, now I'll show you this. This is a diorama that I saw at an auction one time. And this is 3-dimensional, probably 3 feet by 4 foot, but it was quite fascinating. But it kind of shows you an early scene of what it would be like with a hose reel and citizenry helping them. And there's a hand pump there, and there's a different style one over here, trying to deal with a fire that's coming out of the roof of the structure on the left. But took a lot of work.
Yeah. Did many people die in fires?
I imagine, a lot of things back then were wood framed, so, you know, with any kind of delay in getting stuff out, there probably wasn't much that could happen. So fire calls from 1874 to 1904. In 1874, from March through December, we had 6 recorded fire calls. Not much, just a little line item that's a couple of words and a location that was real cryptic. A lot of them were at Phoenix Iron or the Pottery Works. And, we had a lot of them set from railroad trains because they were all steam engines back then. But in 1881, there was a fire at the Shanson Keeley Foundry in Spring City. Now, the alarm went out from there by telegraph to Norristown, Pottstown, and Phoenixville. So once the telegraph message got to the fire station, and we were still at the old location by a year, they took the hose wagon down to the Philadelphia and Reading Railroad Station, which is now where Norfolk Southern is, and loaded it up on a flatbed car. Steam engine brought it up to Royersford where they unloaded it, and they ran it across the bridge into Spring City. At that point, Spring City had no hydrant system. There was no pumpers there yet, so what the recorded history says is that they went into service helping the owners of the company remove patterns and records and things like that out of the building and assist neighbors of this place, because this was just being consumed and all kinds of shards and burning embers would be flying, and people at the time had wood shake roofs and things, so what they were doing, putting their bedding and curtains up on the roofs and pouring water over, trying to prevent the fire from spreading. And that's from a history that somebody had written up there, so it's quite a bit of activity. But they said about 2 hours after Phoenix hose took the ladder arrived, Pottstown and then Norristown arrived with a pumper truck, so then they were able to put out whatever was left of that. And in 1882, there was a large fire at the iron patterns shop that broke out in the middle of the night. It was right across from the firehouse, which again was right next to behind Molly McGuire's. And the pattern shop was the building that was prior to the foundry building that we know now. So that totally burned to the ground. There was the night watchman found a small fire, and when he hit it with a bucket of water, the fire spread, indicating there was liquid there, and it smelled of coal oil. So that there was a strike going on at the time, so that burned that place to the ground.
Was he injured?
I don't think so. So in 1900s, again, just tell you how things, there were 13 recorded fire calls, so we almost doubled. 1904, the Great Fire of Baltimore, we responded by train once again, but with no apparatus. We just sent firemen down. An express train, they left town about 1 o'clock and arrived about 4 to 5. And we're in service for 24 hours down there. Fought alongside the Atlantic City Fire Department, and we have a record in our file from the chief of the Atlantic City Fire Department, just saying what a great job our members had done. And then one other notable fire was the one at the covered bridge that connected Montclair and Phoenixville. And there's time to time there's been pictures published about that. So, okay, in 1901, this is the fire station that we had up at the beginning while June talked. In 1899, we paid off the mortgage, that $5,000 mortgage on the property. So they secured a loan to build a new firehouse. They sold the lumber from the old wood frame one. And during 1900, 1901, they constructed a 2-story brick station on Church Street. It was $15,000, and again, this is the same station that we had up earlier. So separate doors for the go in. Interestingly enough, you're not going to see it in any of these, but when we did some construction recently, we found steel channels embedded in the floor, and they're basically, it's 2 sides like this, face up, side by side. And where those 2 doors would have been. Here, what we figured out, and by going back in the records, they were to guide the wagon wheels when they backed them in to keep them going straight. So we have a piece of one of those down there now. All right, now we're leaving the age of manpower and going up to horse-drawn stuff. So again, in 1903, they bought a Holloway combo chemical and hose wagon. So this would have been a triple combination because it had the chemicals in the tanks there, sitting under the driver, had hose, and then it had the ladders. So you get triple firefighting service. And then in 1906, they bought the American LaFrance steam pumper, which would do 600 gallons a minute.
Name the horses, David.
I'm not I'll get
Bob,
to that
George,
in a second.
Harry,
I'm not
Ralph.
sure if it was Duke and Harry or not, because there was a couple of horse teams back then that only lasted a year or two.
Duke and Harry were white perch earns.
Yeah. And this is probably Duke and Harry, that I'm not sure of. And this would be your buddy Nate White. All right, now we're gonna do another.
Sam and George.
Were there still other fire hoses?
No, in the 1890s, they came up with cotton, form of cotton hose. Okay, let's get this. All right, I'm gonna go beyond this for a second and
You mind
bear with me.
working the camera for us?
Right. How do I-
I'm working on number 6 right now, so.
Do you know how to work the camera? As long as Dave doesn't move.
It's good.
It's fine.
Oh, heck. Now, this is a great, just bear with me for a second.
No
I get
problem.
this going before it's wide.
Sue and I took care of them all for you. Nobody moved.
Good.
Hey, Mark? You got it to go earlier. I lose my.
You didn't put them in the Word top?
No, I didn't. Oh, wait a second. I may do it. All right, hold on.
So it's not up, you file and refresh.
Should I continue with my little spiel, David?
Well, we can go beyond this and I can play with it later. I can, this can be shown at any time. I can,
It's up to you.
yeah.
Oh, go back to the red,
We'll get beyond, this is worth watching though. The video I'm trying to bring up is one from the Pennsylvania National Fire Museum, that's incredible. So, but anyway, so that's our well, it's actually our second and third horse drawn because we got the old Leverick ladder wagon from the 1880s. But at this time, we had our own horse teams and couple of horses in 1903 and 4, and then finally they wound up with a pair of Duke and Harry.
David,
Yes,
do you have any idea what the population was in Phoenixville in that era?
I think around 7,000 or 8,000 back then.
Really?
Wow.
That's a lot.
Yeah, there are maps out called Sanborn maps, we have them at the Historical Society, and they were put out by the insurance industry for any towns of 2,000 or more, and basically it was a layout of the street and all the buildings were color-coded by construction, yellow was frame, red was brick, and they had incidents on the fire companies and what the water system was, and basically it was like an underwriter map to know how much risk there was with a building burning. So from that and they always had the population too. So, but anyway, this is the 1903 Holloway in response. I think this is probably a stage picture with a photographer standing by, but that's in with full gallop. And then the same thing with the steamer with a head of steam going in it. So, because I understand back then they would have a fire all stoked up in the burner on that steamer, ready to go with the kindling in there. So when they had an alarm, they would put a match to it and started burning, so that by the time they got there, they at least had a head start on trying to get steam going enough to start a pump running. So. I love the look of the clothing and all the people what they were wearing back then. This was probably I'm gonna guess 1906 or 7, because they probably took these pictures after they got the new apparatus. All right, now we're getting the paid drivers and their horses. So this is Nate White on the range with Duke and Harry. So Nate White started in 1903, and he worked at the firehouse until 1943. So, this is Duke and Harry for sure. And just noticed this a while ago when I blew it, he had a cat on his hat with this. No information on the cat, but
That's when the horses
And
slowed down.
1903 they had- Pardon?
That's when the horses slowed down, the cat would jump on their tails.
Oh, okay. 1903, we had, acquired our first permanent horse teams. We had several teams over the years, and the most well-known is Duke and Harry, which served for 11 years, and it ran 375 calls at that time. They said one of them had missed one call one time, and Nate White was the driver for 40 years down there, and he cared for and trained them. They were highly prized and well-loved by the town. They were champions of reform. He taught them many tricks, and every year back then, the Devon Horse Show had mainline fire companies in competition, and Duke and Harry won blue ribbons and silver cups in 1911 and 1912, besting all the other horse teams, and we still have 2 big silver cups down the firehouse from them. So they were loved by all the town. Sue Marshall from the Historical Society had done an article on Nate White and the horses about 2 years ago that appeared in the monthly or the quarterly newsletter, and she got into a lot more detail from newspaper articles, and they say the town somehow, I guess, word got back to town, and the townspeople left Phoenixville and met Nate and the horses coming back at the edge of Valley Forge Park and gave them an escort back into Phoenixville. So,
Dave, where were Duke and Harry, where did they live when they weren't hauling apparatus?
I'm not sure. I would assume normally they would have had a stable inside the firehouse.
Inside the farmhouse?
Or right
Who
next
cared
door,
for them?
yeah.
Nate.
Well, Nate
Nate.
would have.
Nate.
At the time, there were, right now, behind the firehouse on Prospect is a grass lot, but there were 2 houses back there that were torn down, but early on, the drivers got to live there. So, and most of the fire horses back then were trained to come, they weren't locked, they were trained to come out when the bell rang. And they had special harnesses that they could quickly, they were split, so they would, the horses were trained to go into place, and the harnesses could be lowered on them by pulley system, and these big things would be strapped on them real quick, and they could get them out the door pretty quick, so. And then these are all real photo postcards. We have a big photo postcard down the firehouse, the collage of these with Duke and Harry doing different tricks with Nate. Again, these are all taken out front of the firehouse. You can read them, Duke taking bandage off his leg, Duke rolling a barrel, Harry taking off Nate's tie, and then Duke taking off Nate's cap. Now this is Jackson Street, and that's the Church Street School in the background there, so Harry was kicking with the school children here. I pointed out that wagon over there. That's a 1903 Studebaker sprinkler wagon. And Phoenixville's looking ladder followed his footsteps of Maine and Royersford and bought one of those and used it till 1918, and it was a way of fundraising. They would load it up with water and dirt streets, they wet the streets in front of your house if you wanted to keep the dust down. And they did that for 15 years.
Since it was Studebaker, was that considered high-end?
I know. I don't know what it would have looked like, and they even sold advertising on there.
Yeah.
The fire companies and pride of their members, volunteer fire companies were very prominent social organizations. Being a member was an honor and limited to a set number of members. Over the years, you'd see in the minutes they were added or subtracted to those who could belong. Each company went the extra mile to shine above the others, and there was a lot of pride in the apparatus, the firehouse, the uniform, and the horses. A lot of social events, many were fundraisers. Our first social event in 1873 was held in the Masonic Hall, and it was a ball or a dance. That was recorded in the minutes. I know they made about $150 on it, I think. So they traveled great distances to attend parades and events and housings. And they also went on excursions as groups. Early 1900s, they went by train up to visit the new elevated rail line in New York City. It was built by Phoenix Iron Company. They also went to they took a train and a steamboat trip to Baltimore, Newport, News, Richmond, and Washington, D.C. by train, and then they also made excursions to Atlantic City.
Know what that elevated line is, or?
I don't know which one. It was just the elevated rail. It's in our minutes in there that they went up. I assume there's some stuff. I don't know if there's still an elevated rail in New York City now. I know there's in Chicago, but There's in
They
Philly.
turned it into a highway park.
A garden,
The High Line,
It's
the
highlight.
High Line, the
Okay.
garden.
it
Yeah.
sits on
Yeah,
the
Philly
west
is.
side.
Okay, so that may maybe what they went up to see.
Schuylkill River
Of course, a lot of the
Heritage will have that.
Members of the fire company, I'm sure, were employees of the steel plant, so it was a matter of pride. So this is a picture, now this is a picture, getting ready to go to a parade, and they were all, I mean, if John, you can tell, this is what we may wear to a parade, something like this, but you know, they had full memorabilia. And if you look here, this is the fire company side, and this is the Phoenixville military band side, so they always hired a band to go with them. So, and this pendant here is right there, it still exists, it's silk, and it's all rolled up and locked up in the boardroom, because every time it gets unrolled and looked at, more falls apart. You can't hang it, it falls apart by its own weight, but it's absolutely brilliant in color still, and it's depicted the steam engine on there. This drum is still there, this was on exhibit at the Historical Society. These trumpets, we still have, and a lot of these wood chairs are sitting on, we still have all them down in the firehouse. So, a lot of things have survived, and you can see based on this picture that basically was still the same original architecture on the building. So, you know, we would put this picture around 1910. All right, now we move beyond horses, and we bought our first motorized apparatus in 1917, Brockway combination chemical and hose car. And again, that would be triple, because I can see a ladder on there. There was a chemical tank on there where I guess you would put the bicarbonate soda with acid or something that would pressurize the tank, and maybe have a little booster line or something. And I assume it may have had a pump on it, although I'm not sure. And then a 21 Stutz triple combination chemical and hose pump. And this is, yes, the Stutz who made the famous automobiles. This is on Gay Street across from the post office, and that's the church across the street. I believe that's on Main Street. You see the trolley tracks in both pictures, it looks like.
When did the trolley stop running?
They were only running for about 10 or 15 years, I think, so. Now, we'll have to ask what happened to Duke and Harry. Well, in 1918, when they got these trucks, they sold them to a farmer and let them, they retired and lived out their normal lives on the farm. But I'm sure that was quite traumatic to get rid of them. They were so well loved. Motorized apparatus continuing, we also had bought a 1926 Prospect Deluge firefighter and a 28 Maxim. Neither one of these are ours, but I cannot find any pictures of them anywhere. We know from the minutes what they bought. So, again, this is the closest I can come to depicting what we had. And back then, and that old, if you go back to that old horse-drawn ladder wagon that they bought from the city of Reading in 1886, that thing fell apart around 1910, 1912. So Borough was without a ladder truck for many years until it was replaced in 1938 with a Seagrave aerial ladder. This was had a 65
Larry
foot
Burns.
stick on it. And,
Yeah. David,
yes,
I see the Larry Burns sign.
yes.
I worked for him.
Did you really?
Yes, I did.
That's where we got our high school yearbook
Yeah.
pictures taken.
He had
his picture taken
Well, this picture I'm gonna say was probably from the 40s or 50s. So, and then that's the
Main
firehouse.
Street Hill.
You can see in this picture that some things have changed. The hose tower's down, the balcony's gone, and they got rid of the double doors and put a central door in. So that all happened, I think, in 2 different renovations in the 30s. So. And then motorized apparatus continuing, we bought a 41 Mack triple combination engine for $8,000 and a 49 Mack for $45,000. Now when I joined the firehouse in 1971, this was still there. So that's the first truck I ever drove. That was what they taught me on. So, we didn't really use it for fire calls. We used it for a utility truck, and during the Dogwood Festival, we had put wooden benches in the back and used to give kiddie rides in the back of it. So,
What about the white truck?
How much is a modern
Dave.
truck?
Yeah, that's one of the best.
a modern truck, I'll get to that in a little bit, okay? So, you remember any of these?
The light truck I drove, I only drove it to football games
Okay. For lights, and the lights weren't
at
real,
night.
The lights weren't very bright.
No.
Oh,
I remember when,
You flipped your picture.
The ladder truck, I remember that 38 Seagrave. When the ladder collapsed back down on Bridge Street.
it collapsed.
Yeah.
I never heard about that.
Oh,
What
yeah.
happened?
It collapsed down on Bridge Street near Shannon's. Ernie Nagy was going up the ladder, I was behind him.
Okay.
And when it came down, he rode it down, and I was only on the first or second step.
So you're talking about the main, because this basically would go up in the air.
It wasn't supposed to collapse.
Right, no, but there would be two sections that would slide up inside of the lower section, so you're saying the cable broke or
Yeah,
something, and all came
something, I
sliding
don't
back
know,
in.
something.
That would be scary.
Yeah. Well, it's still here.
That one.
This picture of the 41 Mac was taken in 1954. That is in the city of Baltimore, and we were down there. We were invited guests for the 50th anniversary of the Great Fire of Baltimore. So we attended the commemoration parade for that fire as a special guest because we had gone down and responded to fight fires. So I'll get back to your costs now. So firehouse, 1962, we bought a second building. 1959, the Phoenix School District sold the Church Street Elementary School to us for $12,500. For $90,000 more, we converted it into a bingo hall, which is still what's there today. Prior to this, having this building, they held the bingo games in a small auditorium on the second floor, but with a new hall, weekly bingo games just took off, and they used to make a ton of money on those, but bingo kind of lost its popularity, so we closed it a year ago, but I think over the years, they would make anywhere from $30,000 to $50,000 on bingo games.
wow.
Yeah, equivalent in today's money. 1968, now we're getting a little more expensive in our apparatus. The 68 Hawn engine was $32,000, and now instead of that original hand pump that did 150 gallons, this thing would do 1,000 gallons a minute. And the Seagrave ladder is now 100 foot instead of the 65 foot that's 38 Seagrave was. These two were the main trucks when I started driving, and Dick, you were chief down there, or a young lieutenant back when I joined. Eventually went on to become the chief. And the Hawn was built in Hamburg, PA. Hawn Motors up there, so there was a local manufacturer. Seagrave was out in Clinton, Wisconsin. If you notice, that's an open cab. We did have a convertible top that we would put on in the winter, but in the summer it was just a real thrill to drive that thing open cab, with the exception of the rainstorms.
Yeah.
So I remember driving that to a fire call with somebody holding an umbrella. The water was running all over the control panel and the dashboard with all the switches and all, and just waiting for something to start smoking. But
Does that take a while to learn how to operate on this?
when you're young, it comes quicker.
Yeah.
I mean, basically, yes. Your lever, you're going to put it in the hydraulic PTO. Your levers here are going to put the outriggers out to stabilize the truck. And then you got three levers here to raise, to rotate, or extend. So it's not too bad, but you got to learn what you can do and
Those
can't
three
do.
levers are still used today in the trucks.
Yeah, actually the new ones do. And then, so that was 100 foot up here, and then we had probably about 120 or 150 feet down at the hose bed. I don't know.
105, I think.
How much?
105, I think.
105?
Yeah.
Go 28 footers, a 35 footer, and some 16s and a,
50?
The 50.
yeah.
It's
That had a
fire
50-foot
shade.
banger ladder in it. Yeah, that was a
Tormentor four.
3-fly regular old ladder that you carried, and it had big bars, tormentor bars that came in. It took 6 people to raise that. We only ever did it on drills, and never used it at a fire, thank God. It was scary. I remember one time going out, St. John's Lutheran Church had moved to St. John's Circle, and for a drill night, they wanted to have a cable hung from the very peak if anybody's ever been in that church. So we took that 50-foot banger ladder into the church, put some wood down so it wouldn't wreck the floors, and put it up. And Scott Schubert, who ran this car wash out here until it closed climb that thing with a long extension cord and a drill and put the set up in the roof beam and drop the cable down.
Wow. Scary. A risk.
So, we were up to 68, now we decided the Slime Lime was the new color.
The ice cream
and
truck.
The ice cream truck, and we were the renegades in town. Of course, there were two other fire companies, and other ones in the area, but we decided we wanted to go with the newest and greatest, and there was a whole visibility thing to come up with the yellow trucks. And plus, at 79 Pierce, it was a smaller truck, but we bought it, we had a lot of narrow alleys in town, and it was a cheaper price. So we had that in service. I think it had 600 gallons of water per minute, and we got a lot of versatility out of it. And when we finally sold it, 20-some years later, Spring City bought it and put it in service for about 5 or 6 years. But and at the time, we remodeled the firehouse and took the second floor off and added an addition to the rear. But as I would say, this was the final remodeling of what was a classic building. I mean, if you had that firehouse as it originally appeared, and it would probably be worth a lot of money today. And Westchester has sold a couple of theirs and they've been repurposed, but this thing here, I can remember being at the meeting when they made a decision. Well, the Boy Scouts were upstairs and they were a pain, and you know what? They didn't know how to get rid of them. They wanted them out of the building, and the gas went from $0.25 to $1 a gallon, and the oil bills were going skyrocket. So that was it. That was the end of the second floor, and we came up with this. So basically where we are today. So that's the 3 trucks that we had in service around 1997.
Is that an original chimney?
Yep. I don't know if it's the original to the school building, but it was left, what was left there when they took the second floor off. But you get the, what we have in place here now is the 79 Pierce Tactical, the 89 Pawn engine, and then the 1991 Emergency 1 aerial ladder, and that's a 110-foot aerial ladder. The mini pumper cost $35,000. The Hahn was $155,000, and the 110-foot aerial ladder was $405,000.
See, that's
And now we come up to where we are today.
yeah, see.
We bought 3 trucks in 2008. They all kind of came in together. You get the KME engine, which is Kovach Motor Equipment. They're up just outside of Jim Thorpe. They're manufacturers. We're still paying that one down. And the borough bought the aerial ladder, which we went back to 100-foot, but a heavier duty, for $700,000. And that doesn't include any equipment that's carried in it. So, but you know, when you go back, we've made a lot of progress since then. And then we also bought the utility pickup truck, which is used for odds and ends, and we have fire police can use it. We can use it to go to training school, or if we have to, you know, like when we went out to Harrisburg to visit the Pennsylvania National Fire Museum, we took that truck out. And now we have a 2001 Pierce engine that came from Friendship when they stopped fighting fires, and that's it in action over on Dayton Street. The houses are still standing, ready to fall over. And we also have since then picked up another utility vehicle, and we have a 3rd engine, which is a 1999 quality, but we only have driven the fire station to 2. So one of the fire underwriter said we needed a reserve engine in town. So we keep one down the borough garage, and utility sits out front, and the ambulance is parked in the rear of the fire station in a shed. So come a long way in 144 years. 1,500 hand pumper and 150 gallons a minute to our 2008 engine at 1250. And one person can run that.
Wow.
1800s ladder wagon to the 2008 aerial.
What's the tallest building in town?
Well, it's probably St. Peter's place. And we used to run over to the Montgomery County Geriatric Center, but we're not on the first alarm there anymore. But that, the 100-foot aerial ladder will work for that. We've done that once in a fire situation. And it's not always just the height, it's sometimes the reach. Because if the house sits back and you can't get in the front yard, it may be a 2- or 3-story building, but you use most, you're going at it at a long angle like this.
So how many calls do you get, like a year now?
Well, right now, I'll get into that right now. Could be my straight person. So back in 1874, 37 members, now we have 47 volunteers, full-time paid and 18 part-time paid, and about 10 administrative people that are volunteers on the board. Back then, there were little or no training available except for Charles Schaefer, who started it. Today, we're highly trained. Most have national firefighter certifications, multiple certifications. Back then, we had one ladder wagon and 2 hose reels. Today, it's 3 engines, a ladder truck, 2 utilities, and 3 chief cars. And we went from 600 calls in the first year to roughly 600 now. And back then, we were in a small firehouse, and now we're still in the 1900 outdated Church Street firehouse. So we were limited to a 60,000-pound aerial. We can't put equipment in. We have height issues. We don't have enough space. We have a large bingo hall that we're in the process of putting a boat and a utility truck in there. We're looking at how we have to reinforce that floor. It's a meeting room and also a physical fitness room. But we've been working with the borough for the past 3 years now to come up with a location for a new firehouse and coming up with funding. We can't buy it. We just don't have the money anymore. But we're working with them, and we're willing to give up the property we own to the borough, help them build a new firehouse, whether it's on Church Street or somewhere else. So then, in conclusion, I just wanted to go over the crews that we had over the years. In 1906, this is 2 pictures. That's the Chemical Holloway, 1903, but that's the crew that was pictured on it then. I don't know where that picture was taken, but that hangs down the historical side. Of course, here's, we saw this one earlier, here's Nate White, who's the main character in June's novel. One of the main, and I'm not sure who the other 2 are. Crew around 1930.
He saw you.
And this is 1942. That is Nate White. He died in 1945, 3 years later. So, but we have all the names of everybody, and actually, Joe, they look familiar? Right there? Is that your dad?
Could be grandfather.
I could tell you, I have all their names in the book here, so if anybody's curious. And we put the Nate White's holding somebody who's in the services picture, not a relative. And then that is General what was the big general in World War II? MacArthur. It's his son. So that's how we dated the picture, because we went back in the Life magazine when they had the anniversary of all their covers. So that's how we put a date on there. And that's really the way the inside of the firehouse looked back then. There was a balcony there. The pole to slide down was right here out of view. The game well system was over on that upper left wall. And there was hose drying racks down there. And the tin ceiling that you see, they're still there. It's above the aisles. Okay, crew 1974.
John Burridge.
Oh, boy.
Oh, yeah. George Orlov, Larry Gardner, Dave
They haven't changed it yet.
Lee,
Oh, my God,
Fred Fellini, Bill Gauss,
No
Long,
pompadours.
Scott Schubert, number 11, and Chet
Chet
Hall, Jim Harn, George Filipovic, Jim Turgay, John Fackety, Bruce Barry, Andy Tomko, John Bereggi, Terry Hughes, and Spike Howard.
Who's that good-looking guy, third from the right?
This guy.
That guy.
He's sitting right there.
Oh, wow.
Thanks, Bob.
No, that was our 100th anniversary. We actually have another picture that we took about 5 years ago, that we got as many of these people back together, getting posed holding this picture in our hand. We had about half of that group there. A lot of those guys are gone now. And then 1999, this is the 125th anniversary. There he is again.
Does Amy Barton and
Back in there, but we had a few more people.
Yeah.
Here, that's a mix of the firemen and the fire girls and the
Is
administration.
there only one girl that joined, or 2?
Well, that's Amy Bartow.
Amy Barton.
Lois is there.
Yeah.
Lois is in the front.
Margie, this is Bill O'Neill's wife, Jean.
Lois is right there to their left.
And Jane's in here.
Yeah.
And Laurie Filipovic, although she never really was
Yeah.
a firefighter,
So
she
many
was
of
just
them
slightly involved.
recognize.
And then this is one we had just 2 months ago.
Oh,
Wow. 17.
David, why is the 65 part of Phoenixville number 1?
Why is it?
Yeah, they've had 65 there.
We're stations, Chester County.
It is a Chester
Yeah,
County
Chester
number.
County came up with a numbering system under, and they started in southern Chester County with Oxford at 21 and kind of went all the way across, and then they kept going back in the 60s, went up to the northern part. And then the mainline companies already had their fire board ahead of Chester County. So Berwyn is 2, Paoli is 3, 4 is Malvern, 5 is East Whiteland, and 6 is West Whiteland. And I guess 1 was Radnor, although they were separated on their own. So that's it.
Hey, Dave, I have a question.
Yes.
Are there any homes in Phoenixville or any buildings that have Benjamin Franklin's Philadelphia Contribution Ship fire markers on them like they have on display at the Fireman's Museum in Philadelphia?
Not that I'm aware of.
I would think that I would be, even might be worth it, right, were they?
Yeah, and I read
I was trying to get the history of the
I
two
read
dates.
an article about that
Yeah.
there was a lot of stuff out there that said, well, firemen wouldn't put a fire out if it didn't have the fire mark. Well, that's not
Right.
true.
No,
They
but it
went-
did
they
mean
were
your
in
home was
competition. They
insured
wanted to
by
put the
the.
fire out. Occasionally, they would get a stipend, but it was never much money at all, so.
Right,
so-
just curious.
Thank you.
Thank you. Wow, I wish I had some good information while I was writing my novel.
Yes.
Especially the ruts to guide the wagon wheels.
Yeah,
Was the floor pitched too?
no, it was level.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Even if it was pitched.
Yeah.
Well, how much time do we have left?
Close it another hour.
Oh, okay. I have to backtrack and tell you the germination of this novel. My original intent was to write about the Knoll House. And in learning about the history of the Knoll House, and those of you who know the Knoll House is where the Knoll Apartments are off of Main and off of Star Street in Maine, and Caribou Village are now. I had a few chapters written when I heard about that the Knoll House in the early 1900s, actually the last one was in 1974, had 3 fires. I won't go into details, but I learned that Dave was part of the crew that fought the fire in 1974. And I asked him to help me research the fires in order to incorporate that into that novel. And that was the main reason that I had gone to the archives back in October of 2016, was to find details about the fires. But when you're a local author, there are some things about the community that a village and a close-knit borough, such as we still are, that you don't write about. Especially when descendants of families are still living and have requested that stories of their parents, their grandparents, their relatives are not to be told, especially when they would harm or resurrect bad memories. So, keeping that in mind and learning that there are a few secrets that are not mine to tell, I scrapped the idea about the Knoll, although I'm going to go back to it because there's some interesting stuff about it during the Civil War, and turned my attention to the fire department. And during the Great War, with Stanley Martinez and now one fire chief, Dave Meadows, based on Dave Meadows, as the 2 main protagonists. I threw in, for those of you who have read previous novels, I threw in Constable Luke Tucker and Inspector Simon Holmes from the Columbia Hotel fame to help solve this series of arsons that occurred around town. And voila, the novel again began to take shape, and the skeleton got flesh on it, and I spent a good 14 months, writing it. So, I also needed a bit of the background of the Great War, and I used 2 articles written by Jack Hertel for the Historical Society about Battery C, the Artillery, and Company D. And both were National Guard units located, as you know, here in Phoenixville. They were federalized in 1917, and eventually the members were shipped to Europe as part of the United States Expeditionary Forces to quell and stem the tide of the Central Powers of Germany, Austria, Hungary, and Italy. And of course we succeeded, and eventually, and as you know, this November 11th is the 100th anniversary of the armistice. So now I had a bit of history of the Great War over there, and a lot of history of the fire department over here, and what happens next. And a bit of a spoiler alert, Stanley does not go overseas like his buddies do. Instead, he joins the fire department and is somehow deferred. He soon learns, though, that being on the line fighting fires here is just as, if not more dangerous, than being on the line of fire over there. Now, to add fuel to the pardon the pun, fire, I had a revengeful arsonist who putt-putts around the borough on a motorized bike setting fires, literally all over. And this is, another pun, hook of my novel. Who is he? What does he? Why does he set the fires? And as I hope the reader will eventually inquire, is he whom we think he is? And is he ever caught? Lastly, how did all of this affect Stanley and his cadre of 4 friends? How did it affect Phoenixville in general? Especially when a revengeful artist is puttering around his way around the borough, setting fires all over it. Well, the complex plot lines kept on getting more and more complicated, and I kept on staying up later and later at night, especially adding in along the way a few romantic subplots and real-life anecdotes that I just couldn't resist using. Thank you, Dave Meadows. To add a bit of local color. And all of this while trying to depict the culture and mores of Phoenixville beset and affected by a global war. And to be very honest, I was really daunted by this, more so than my last 3 novels. It became a challenge, and as I said, it took me 14 months, nearly as long as the United States was in the war, 19 months, to do the research and the writing, and probably is so far, as I said, the hardest I've written. But I want to really thank Dave, who spent endless hours teaching me as much detail as I could absorb about firefighting, and the endless hours spent researching details about the Great War, both here and abroad, which incidentally resulted in an article in this past December's Historical Society newsletter, Keeping the Home Fires Burning. And there's some really fascinating details in there what Phoenixville was really, really like back then, not just the fire department, but in general. The hardest part in writing a novel, of course, is the ending, the final denouements, and resolving what happened to all of the characters, and including, for those of you who know, the wondrous Percheron fire horses, Duke and Harry, their driver, Nate White, a descendant of whom I was thrilled to meet over the holidays. I must admit, that was the hard, I cried when I wrote about Duke and Harry, but anyway. I must admit, as I learned about fires, starting them as well as putting them out, I had some fun. Now, a lot of fun burning down a few buildings around Phoenixville. I even backdated the Major Knoll house to incorporate mine and David's research, and that led to interesting plot feeds and coincidences. Needless to say, as I wrote, the fire and the spark of creativity kept on flaring up. I could go on and explain to you all of the things that David taught me about firefighting and the clothes that they wore and the lint and the leather that, when it was really hot, stuck to your clothes and stuck to your skin. I had to learn how the game wheel alarm system worked, and how when the red boxes was triggered, the klaxon horn atop the pipe fitting building would sound and set off a bell in the firehouse. But he even had me memorize a few codes. And I'd walk into the Historical Society occasionally and I'd go, David, 28, Bridget, Maine. And he'd go, what was 42? And I don't remember, so anyway. He was a real stickler, and I tried my best to be a good student and a writer, and to write a novel that would do not only him, but the village of Phoenixville, and as well as the fire department, justice. The novel is as much mine and the fire department's, it's as much the fire department's and Dave's as it is mine. And I'm quite proud of this one. I hope you are too. They're here in the library. All of my novels are here in the library. The Phoenix Hose, Hook and Ladder is the latest edition. I have to brag and say that the McInerney family, all 3 of us authors, have our own shelf now. Yeah, Jay McInerney, Monica McInerney, and now June McInerney, and that's very humbling, very, very humbling. So, the love of writing runs in our family, and I hope the love of reading runs in yours. And that's, now, unless you want me to answer any questions, or would you like me to read from the novel, I mean, it's up to you. You love to what?
Love to hear you.
You love to hear me read?
What is code 28?
Broad name, I think.
There's no
I think I have to
broad.
look that up in my
Bridge, maybe? There's no broad.
No broad. I had whatever.
There are 2 broads, but not at Maine.
All right.
Maybe they are.
So, was she out training?
Great. I structured the novel for every month that the United States was in the war, and I started with May of 1917 and it went on to November, actually December of 1919, because I had to figure out the ending for some of the characters, including Stanley. Well, he was one of the main character, right? Okay, so this is the beginning of chapter dated June 5th, 1917. I can't do this, guys. Stanley stood frozen on the top step of the entrance to Borough Hall, glaring with trepidation at the large white double doors. Beads of cold sweat condensed under his arms and on his palms. He rubbed his damp hands down the front of his dark green work pants, trying to ignore the small voice whispering inside his mind. If only I could open the doors and go inside, my life, the very life of Stanley Francis Martinez. Even if I did something, somehow, survive, it would never be the same. He brushed a lock of dark curly hair from his forehead. He had his Mexican's father's short, wiry build and dark complexion that sharply contrasted with his Irish mother's twinkling sapphire blue eyes and thin aquiline nose. "Hey, you chickening out on us?" Edmund Hope asked, bounding up the stairs to stand next to Stanley. At least 6 inches taller than his friend, he was a ruddy-faced, slender, but strong redhead with dark brown eyes. "We made a pact, you know," he said, rubbing his hands together, licking his lips in anticipation of the future. Edmund, Stanley knew from years of growing up together, would do anything dangerous on a dare. "I'm breaking it." "Why, Stan?" Edmund turned the other 3 young men who clustered on the steps behind, waiting for Stanley to lead them into the building. It was a balmy afternoon in early June of 1917, the first day of registration for the Selective Service. In April, America had declared war against the Central Powers of Germany and Austria-Hungary, joining the forces of the Triple Entente, France, Russia, and Great Britain. To swell the ranks of the army, just a little over 150,000 in number, Congress had passed the first phase of the Selective Service Act of 1917. Men born between 1886 and 1896 were to register for the draft on or after June 5th. Stanley had just turned 21, and like other single men his age without any dependents in Phoenixville, along with his 4 closest buddies, was eligible. Edmund Hope and the 3 others worked in various shops of the Phoenix Iron Company and the Phoenix Bridge Company. They had collectively reasoned that now that their country was at war, it was their civic duty to defend its democracy and its freedoms against all kinds of aggression. Each had made a promise to one another to sign up together. And Stanley, too, had initially gone along with the agreement, but in his heart he wasn't entirely sure. Mere moments after making the pact, Stanley instantly regretted it. He ached to back out, but to him, once his word was given, it was a matter of honor not to break it. After the registration period ended, the local draft board, per the law, would compile a list of non-registrants, who would then receive a letter postmarked from Washington, D.C., demanding that they report for duty. Failure to do so was punishable by imprisonment, and in cases of flight, execution. But now, even with the threat of being forcibly conscripted or punished, Stanley couldn't shake his feelings of dread. But I really would rather you read it. And I have some copies here for sale, and Sue will gladly be cashier as I sign, if that's what you'd like me to do. The cost is $19.18, but we're just dropping that to $19. $19.18. Also, I also want to announce that for every month now, for a while, because there's so many charities in Phoenixville, and because I would like to give back to the community that's been so kind to me, every month I'm going to donate $2 from the proceeds of every sale to a charity. February is now St. Anne's Cold Blue. Okay. March is Good Samaritan Services. I'm not sure about April. I'm thinking maybe the library. We can talk about that. So, here you go. You can buy it for a gift. Also, St. Valentine's Day is coming up. See, the book is read.
Will they be sold anywhere else after tonight?
Yeah, they're available at Gateway Pharmacy, online at Amazon.com, and also at the historical center.
Get you.
Any questions, people getting to the audience?
Thank you.